some people are threatened by the rise of nationalism. This is particularly true for multi-ethnic empires. These are empires, monarchs, who rule over many different ethnic groups. And one of the best examples of this would be the multi-ethnic Austrian Empire, which instead of being made up of simply one nation, one ethnic group, is made up of Germans, Hungarians, Romanians, Czechs, Slovaks, Slovenes, Croatians, Serbians, Italians, Ruthenians, and others. So theoretically, this multi-ethnic Austrian Empire could break up into multiple different countries, multiple different nation states. And so places like the Austrian Empire are not going to like nationalism because it threatened to destroy their empire and to split it up. And as we'll see, it's going to be the area around the Austrian Empire and the rise of nationalism that will eventually lead to World War I. Now, here's the thing, though. How do you convince people that they should put loyalty to the state, to their nation state, above loyalty to their families and their faith? Right? There could be a lot of reasons why you might prefer to be loyal to your family or to your religion, to your God, than you are loyal to the nation state. So, and there's a very interesting book called Turning Peasants into Frenchmen. And this book is about how they had to convince these peasants who lived in France, some of who did not speak French or who spoke very odd dialects of French, how to convince them that they should put more attention to Paris and to their nation state, Paris being the capital of the nation state, than to their own families and to their Catholicism. Right? How do you do this? Now, of course, the reason you would want to do this is because nationalism gives you a great amount of power. Right? If you're just an active citizen who's willing to actively serve their government, for example, giving your government your gold freely when your government is a national emergency, that gives the government a lot of power. So governments have a very definite interest in creating nationalism. And there are several ways you do this. One is through compulsory education. Sometimes people will say, well, education shouldn't be about teaching people values. It shouldn't be about indoctrinating people, they would maybe even say. It should just be about teaching the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And I'm not criticizing that view or supporting it, but what I want to point out, though, is that the public schools never really had that as their only goal, never had simply the imparting of knowledge as their only goal. They also have traditionally, in most countries that I know of, in all countries I know of actually, compulsory education was not just meant to teach you the skills you need to work in an industrial society, was also meant to teach you the standard language, to get you to stop speaking the dialect that you maybe spoke at home, that funny French or kind of odd German that you spoke at home, but to get you to speak proper German or proper French, which means the capital, the kind of German or French that was spoken in the capital. Or today in Korea, the kind of Korean that's spoken in Seoul. And also to teach you national history. And you can see this in particular in the fact that you start off the day in a public school, and actually in most private schools that I know of, by reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Right? That is an exercise in nationalism and encouraging children to be nationalistic. And that's something that our schools do. And that's something that schools did certainly very well in the 19th century. Another way of creating nationalism, and this is more so in Europe, continental Europe, not really England and the United States, but in many places, nationalism was inculcated through compulsory military service, what we call conscription. And basically, you may have noticed that some of the most patriotic people tend to be soldiers because they spend their lives and risk their lives, in fact, trying to protect the country. So they usually are very nationalistic. And this is often encouraged by militaries, especially by these continental European militaries in the 19th century. And what's important to stress, all these militaries on continental Europe, not in England, had the draft. Everyone, all men, were expected to serve for several years in the military. So they were taught to be nationalistic in elementary school and public schools, and then also that lesson was reinforced in the military. And the military, it's very important to make sure that the soldiers are nationalistic. For one thing, you need large citizen armies to protect your country from foreign and domestic threats. And you need them to be loyal. And to make sure they're loyal, you want to encourage them to be nationalistic, to put their first loyalty to the nation state and the government that represents it. In addition, you want them to be loyal because the military poses the largest threat to civilian government because they are a bunch of people with guns. Right? The military is very powerful. And if they're not loyal, they could very easily turn those guns against the government and take over for themselves. And occasionally that does happen when you have military coups. So it's very important that those people be nationalistic and loyal to the government. And the first two things are really focusing on the government. The last thing, though, isn't so much of an emphasis on the government, and that is newspapers. Newspapers help to create a community beyond the village. And what I mean by that is that there's lots of people, for example, who read the New York Times who don't live in New York. And the idea is that because this is kind of a national newspaper. And so while we have local newspapers, you may even notice, though, when you read a local newspaper, it also often covers national events. And you may recall how just a bit ago I talked about this idea of imagined communities, not imaginary communities, not ones that we make up, but communities that aren't face-to-face. And newspapers and now cable news and internet news helps to give us a feeling that even though we live in Greenwood, South Carolina, we're part of a larger country. And that national events, what goes on in Washington, affects us a lot. In a sense, what I find interesting is, of course, it's easier in a way to know what is going on in Washington than what's going on in Columbia, even though that's our state capital. And this is important because these newspapers and news are creating a sense that we belong to a nation, not simply a local community. Now, just to show you the kind of idea of how difficult these things are to overcome these local loyalties, I also included this political cartoon by the Australian Labour Party, which is an anti-conscription drive, because it says, "Vote no, Mum, they'll take Dad next." Because, of course, that conscription, forcing people to be in the army, isn't particularly popular. But you have to be able to overcome these things if you want to encourage nationalism. And of course, this shared education, this shared military service, and newspapers are going to help spread nationalism so that we'll be able to overcome that great divide. Rich or poor, elite or commoner, everyone is going to be able to become nationalistic within a single nation state. And so nationalism is going to help bridge that great divide, in some ways in a deeper way than religion will be able to. Now, to give you an idea about how nationalism and democracy work together, I want to turn to Britain and reform. Right? We talked about how Marx had predicted that you would have a communist revolution in Britain because it was the most advanced industrial country and therefore was the one that was theoretically oppressing workers the most. But here's the thing. Britain, in addition to being a democracy, was also nationalistic. And those two things are going to work together, as we'll see, to make it so that communism will not have a successful revolution in Britain. Remember, the strength of democracy is its ability to deal with conflict through reform and integration. So, for example, we talked about how you had the rise of the bourgeoisie, this new group of factory owners, of doctors, of lawyers, of accountants, of teachers and clerk government officials, and so forth. And these people were gaining in economic and social power in the late 18th and early 19th century. And in some ways, this threatened the power of the old elites. But instead of saying, well, we're going to ignore you and we're going to just keep all the power for ourselves, the old elites recognized the growing power of the bourgeoisie. And in 1832, Parliament passed a Reform Act that increased male suffrage, made it so that more men could vote by lowering the property demands that you needed. So this allowed more of these people to vote, and that transformed them to be people who possibly threatened to overthrow the system into people who supported the system because they now were a part of that system because they had the vote. In 1867, 30 years later, there was a recognition that things had changed, that now there were more people who had grown in wealth and power, and so they should be recognized and be brought into the government. And so in 1867, you had a Reform Act that doubled the electorate, meaning that twice as many people could now vote. So Britain is dealing with these differences, with the problems of industrial society by expanding power, by giving to new people, by giving more people a voice in the government. And part of this is going to lead to legislation that will lead to a rise in real wages for workers, and that will lead to new safety precautions, to laws outline child labor, or at least limiting child labor. And this is very important, because remember, the logic of capitalism does say, in a sense, you should squeeze your workers for all they're worth. And you can't be nice because that other guy down the street is going to be mean to their workers. Well, now, for example, let's say that there's a minimum wage, and everyone has to pay workers the minimum wage. Well, that allows you then to give the workers a better wage, and you won't be destroyed by competition because everyone has to give them that better wage. And that's how democracy and expanding democracy and reform made it so that things got better for workers in England and or in Britain in general after the 1850s. They're going to start enjoying rises in real wages. And that means that workers are being shown that they can achieve more through reform than revolution. Instead of fighting the government, instead of opposing the government violently, just work through democracy. And so we can see here that democracy is going to give them stability. And what's also important, and this is where the nationalism comes in, is that there's going to be a feeling that their primary loyalty should not be to their class, should not be to their workers, but to the nation. Right? Their primary loyalty is not to other workers, be they in France or Belgium or the United States, but to each other as English people or British people living in the nation. And I want to take a moment here then to contrast this. For example, you have in Marxism this idea that class is more important than nation. In Marxism, remember, the whole idea of history is class conflict. So it follows that your class is the most important thing. Therefore, according to communism, French workers should have more in common with British workers than the French workers would have with French factory owners. That's according to communism. That's the theory. This is why the communist slogan, as I showed earlier in that cartoon, was "Workers of the world unite." Right? Workers, class is most important. Class is what should be united. And that's theoretically how communism is supposed to work. Your most important loyalty is your class. But that was something that Marx kind of got wrong. The combination of democracy and nationalism in England meant that English people were going to see their common nationality, their common ethnicity, as being what was important, not their class. So in nationalism, there's the idea that French workers would have more in common with factory owners than British workers. And this is essentially what happens in Britain. Instead, it's that British workers have more loyalty to other British people, even if they are factory owners, rather than those Frenchmen across the channel, even though they may also be factory workers. And what we'll see time and time again in history is that nation is going to be more important than class. So even though communism focuses theoretically on class, and that's what Marx was thinking about for the most part, in fact, as we'll see as we proceed with our class, even places where communism takes power, their primary interest is going to be in the nation and in that.